how similar the word restore is to re-story. Allow Jesus to retell your story.
We not only want to say, well, God loves me, but does he really, does he choose me?
What was the very private Dallas Willard like when he was not in front of a class or an audience?
I learned so much from the way he handled things. When we traveled together, when the plane would be delayed, and I would be mad about the plane being late, and Dallas would he'd be singing a hymn or something.
At some cellular level, he knew, his body knew, that he could freely trust God with circumstances that he couldn't control. Why in the world would doing nothing be useful, beneficial, a spiritual practice?
To deepen the narrative that I'm not in control.
Today, I'm very excited because I get to talk with somebody who has thought a lot about your life and its story, and who I have known for a long time, who is a friend and has been a friend and been shaped by lots and lots of remarkable people, and that's Jim Smith. Hey, Jim.
Hey, John. Good to see you, brother.
Wonderful to see you. Jim is the Dallas Willard Professor of Christian Spiritual Formation at Friends University, best-selling author of, I think now, over 12 books, has directed the Apprentice Institute, has degrees from Fuller and Yale, was one of the founders of Renovare, which is devoted to folk spiritual growth. So is doing and has done remarkable things. And with all that going on, Jim, I'm just very grateful you would carve out a little time.
Well, of course, John. We go way back, and we're brothers from another mother or from another spiritual father. I mean, you and I have had so much Dallas Willard time together that I think we can finish each other's sentences because we quote Dallas so much. So always good to be with you.
Jim, although Jim's a bit younger than he and I would be one of a number of folks who were deeply, deeply impacted by Dallas Willard and by Richard Foster. And that's part of what I thought, as long as I get the opportunity to talk to you, that I'd love to chat about a bit. So would you tell a little bit of the story of how did you connect initially with Richard? What was that like? How did that impact your life? Did you come from kind of a family of faith? How did you get set on that path?
I didn't come from a family of faith. My Christmas and Easter Methodists, that's what I grew up in. We went twice a year, maybe once more. But when I was 18, I had this emptiness and longing, though my life was great. There was no reason for it. I didn't know what to do, so I went on a religious quest. I tried transcendental meditation. I tried power of positive thinking. Anybody that gave me a book, I gave it a shot, because it was this void inside. I ended up actually meeting a guy who was a street evangelist and part-time fireman, odd combination, but we read the Gospels together. I read Mere Christianity, became a Christian. Within a year, I went to a state school for my first year, mainly I played on the tennis team, but then I thought I got to go to a Christian school. So I randomly, somewhat, chose Friends University. Richard Foster had been there only a year, and no, I didn't know who he was. And I stumbled into a class of his, and my life was forever changed. I got to know him. I said, this cat is coming from another world. He doesn't just talk about God, he seems to know him, and I want to spend time with him. And I would learn later, Richard also felt led to mentor me. So I was one of the recipients of that grace that he decided to spend time. I babysat his boys when they were young. I hung out with him. I traveled with him. And that was massive.
So if you don't know, as you're listening to us, Richard Foster was a Quaker thinker, pastor, academician, and wrote a book called The Celebration of Discipline almost 50 years ago now, in the late 70s, that in many ways was kind of the trumpet call for a deeper understanding of spiritual transformation. How does that take place? How is that connected with a phrase that my wife deeply hates, the spiritual disciplines, and really helped many, many folks in, for lack of better language now, the evangelical church world, reconnect with a lot of spiritual wisdom that for a variety of reasons had been lost. And Jim, pretty early on, you got to hang out with Richard, learn from him. I don't know if you still remember this. I remember him telling about one time when he went to speak someplace and you were with him, but not there for the event, and he had an epiphany. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, we were at Fuller. He took me to a January term course, and that was huge for me because I was, a seminary winter course I got to take, for 2 weeks, and we shared an apartment, and Richard was speaking at all kinds of things, and I was just tagging along. And I stayed up one night late reading Little Flowers of St. Francis, of all things. I just plowed through that book. I didn't wake up in time for chapel, so Richard went to chapel and spoke. I felt terrible when I got up. I did the dishes. I thought, well, I'll try to make myself useful. He comes back from chapel, and he's very excited. Richard has this enthusiasm. And he comes back, and he just gets in my face and says, Jim, you missed it. I said, what? He said, at chapel, we had a theophany. I said, what's a theophany? Okay, I had to, in my mind, go, okay, a visible manifestation of God. And I went, oh my gosh, what happened? He said, while I was preaching, Jesus appeared to me and said, Richard, where's Jim? And then he
Wow.
laughing. And that was a classic Foster story because he had such enthusiasm and loved to make fun and laugh.
Yep, and there's not many other people that make jokes about theophanies. We're not sure if we're allowed to do that or not.
That's true.
So in your book, The Good and Beautiful You, Jim had what used to be a trilogy, now it's really 4 books, The Good and Beautiful God and So. And in The Good and Beautiful You, you talk about the idea of story and people's lives. And we're kind of walking through that notion of what does it mean to have a story. Part of what you write in there, you write about telling your sacred story, that you have one, but that you are not a story. You have a story, but your story doesn't define you. Can you say a little bit more about that? What do you think of when you think of this notion of people having a story that matters, but it's not everything about them?
Well, that chapter, You Have a Sacred Story, in The Good and Beautiful You, was far and away the hardest chapter to write. You know that as a writer, John, sometimes there are chapters that you struggle through for various reasons. And I think it's because it's such an important idea. And I listened to people's stories, and I learned that, first of all, that's just the way God designed us. We love stories. We think in stories. Jesus taught in stories. And so we see our lives as a story. The question, though, then becomes am I my story? Or, does it define me entirely? Or do I recognize that I have a story, but it's not everything? And of course, certainly people who have suffered through trauma and abuse and great grief and loss will say they can define themselves by their story. And I think it's important to say, you have a story. That let's be honest. And it's a sacred story. It is as Eugene Peterson said, a never to be repeated story of grace. Like that's who you are.
And it involves, you say, you're being incarnated. So you have a particular body in a particular family, in a particular culture, in a particular time. So all of those would be elements of the story that you're not necessarily in control of. They're just part of it.
Yeah, most of it we're not. None of us had any say about our being born, into the family we're born in, into the bodies, our race, gender. It all just is like, wow, this is what I am. And that is a big part of our story. And it's one dimension, I think, of our souls. Adrian von Kamm talks a lot about the socio-historical dimension of the soul. And it's in us. I remember Dallas once saying this, he said so many shocking things, but he said, I will be forever the son of Mamie Willard. Like that was that's for his entire existence, even into eternity, he is the son. Yeah. And that's fascinating that God designed us that way.
Yeah. Well, since you brought up Dallas, then talk a little bit about how did you meet him? What was his impact on your life? A lot of folks may not know about the connection between Dallas and Richard Foster. And of course, for folks that listen regularly to Become New, even the title comes from frequent statement of Dallas is the main thing God gets out of your life is the person you become, and that's the main thing that you get out of it. So I talk here about Dallas quite a lot, but say a little bit about your own journey with him and his impact on you.
Well, Richard brought Dallas to Friends University to we had a thing called Christian Emphasis Week, and it was a 3-day, they cut classes short, and you got to go hear a speaker. And Richard was kind enough to say, would you be his host and drive him from the airport and back and so forth. So I went to every lecture, I followed him around, and I did not understand 1/10 of what he said. And I got the tapes. That's how long ago. I literally got the cassette tapes, listened to the tapes, and still didn't understand what he said. But then some years later, in 1988, he was a part of this group that Richard was envisioning, this ministry called Renovari. And when I got to just hang out with him, like normal talking, that was easier to understand. And I started to grasp a little bit more and a little bit more. And then I think it was 1992, 93, I was invited to be his TA at the class he taught at Fuller.
Oh, wow.
And that was a deep immersion because the class blew up to 40 people, and he said, I need an assistant. And Fuller knew me, and Dallas knew me, and Dallas said, yeah, let's do this. So I did that for 7 years. And so I sat there at the table with Dallas teaching, and he said it was co-taught. Like, that's what it said in the binder, but I taught.
That was a lie.
1 hour.
Yeah,
that was a lie. Let's just be honest. It was a huge lie. Very kind of him, but I sat there, and he would teach. It'd be like 8 hours a day.
Yeah,
for 10 days. So that's like 80, and then he did that for 7 years. That's 560 hours of sitting under, and then hanging out with him and getting ice cream and traveling in airports and doing so. And so the influence was massive. I went from really not understanding him for the first few years. Students in the course would come up to me because they were intimidated by Dallas and say, what does Dallas mean when he says, and I would say, I don't know. I don't. By year 3 or 4, I started to be able to answer. And by year 7, I thought, I think I can speak Willardian, and I think I understand his vocabulary. Because as you know, his vocabulary is so different. Like, he defines words differently.
Yeah.
And if you how you define your words, it tells the whole story. So
yeah, he's like read everything there is to read and thought about what he understands everybody to have meant about the human condition. Then when he uses language, it's not technical. There's a lot of people that write about theology or philosophy, and even if they try to popularize it, they use a lot more technical vocabulary. And Dallas didn't do that. There was just a density because every word was like the tip of an iceberg, and underneath it was the substance of human thought for 3,000 years.
John, that's brilliant. I've actually, in my entire life, never thought that. But you're right. He didn't use technical language. But it was still... It's still hard. Yeah.
Yes, it was. I was thinking about your being with him at airports and seeing him in places like that. So a 2-part question here. One, there's a story that you have told that I love about when Dallas was flipping around TV and came on like a Spanish music station. So you're going to tell that one. But then beyond that, I think part of what was so compelling is often when there's somebody who writes or teaches and you see them, read them from afar, and then you meet them, it's a bit disappointing. Talk a little bit about what was the very private Dallas Willard like when he was not in front of a class or an audience?
Well, you're right about that last part, right? Never meet your heroes. But Dallas was the opposite of that. It just got better being around him.
Yeah.
And so when we spent time together, I learned so much from the way he handled things. When we traveled together, when a plane would be delayed, and that's classic life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I would be like mad about the plane being late, and I can't believe that. And Dallas he'd be singing a hymn or something, and when we might say, well, why don't we just get a piece of chocolate or something? And he was just like, he was sort of Zen that way, like, because he knew the kingdom was unshakable and it was okay, no matter what we did. So you start to see how this person is.
Yes,
and a sense of humor. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's not just that he had ruthlessly eliminated hurry from his life, and I'm sure that was always a bit of a struggle, but it's like the deeper part was, at some cellular level, his body knew that he could freely trust God with circumstances that he couldn't control. And there was a genuine freedom inside of him that he didn't have to think about. It's not like he had to say, well, otherwise I would be real frenzied and rushed right now. But because Jim is here, I have to try to be a good model. It wasn't that way. It was just, that was at the core.
It was in his body. He didn't do it with gritted teeth, as he would say. It was it was
we'll
natural.
come back to that. But a phrase that you use in your book is core narrative. And as we think about story, I want to come back to that notion of core narrative. And what were they for Dallas? Because that's part of what was so compelling. And what might they be for me? But also the TV story.
Oh, yeah. So when we were doing the Fuller course, one year we did it in Colorado Springs. And he and I stayed in the house of this. They were art professors. They were gone for the summer. But it was a very strange house, very macabre art, weird things, a three-legged cat. I mean, it was an odd place to be. And there we are. He's got his room, I've got his room, and we're sharing space. But he would come home very tired from teaching for 8 hours. And so he said, well, let's let our brains rest and watch a little television. And so he went to his room and he came back and he was wearing this T-shirt, and a pair of Bermuda shorts, but he left his wingtips on. That was weird. He still had his brown socks and his wingtips on. And we were watching, I think it was a nature show, and we were watching like an alligator eating something, and it was bizarre. He goes, well, let's change the channel. So he goes up. This was how long ago? There was no remote. He had to go up to the TV. He turned the channel. He hit the Spanish channel, and they were like salsa dancing. And Dallas just stepped back and laughed and looked at me, and he started dancing. And the brother could dance. Like he had some moves. And so the image of Dallas Willard dancing in Bermuda shorts and this T-shirt I mean, it was just, I can't get it out of my mind forever.
It's so sad that you didn't video that.
Yeah. Wouldn't that have been so? If I felt like we have phones now then, gosh, priceless.
Okay, so let's come back to this notion of core narrative. I think about the power of story. Dallas would talk a lot about meaning, and that meaning with words or lives is always a matter of a larger context. And really, I think in many ways, story is the context that tells us that our existence has meaning. And part of what you write about in The Good and Beautiful You, and the idea that everybody has a story and a sacred story, is the way that you talk about your story. And then not just that, the way that you experience other people hearing your story and responding to it. If they ignore or withdraw, is that language there, or if they judge you for it or assault you, or if they care and treasure about your story, the way that you experience other people responding to your story actually has quite a lot to do with the kind of person you become. So talk a little bit about that journey of how do we all learn to tell our stories and be shaped by them in the right ways?
Well, this was something I discovered in the 4-year process of creating what became the Good and Beautiful series, that curriculum for Christ-likeness that I was working on, that Dallas had commissioned me to attempt. And so for 4 years, I was working with real people for 30 weeks, listening to them. And I have to admit, John, I came in thinking, well, if we just teach them to do the disciplines, they'll be fine. And they got worse. And what I realized was, if you start doing the spiritual disciplines, but your narratives are toxic, you'll end up worse than where you start.
Yes.
You'll be fasting to get the angry God to be less angry or something. So I discovered that, and then I started listening to their stories. I was like, well, who is God to you? What's your God story? What's your self story? What's your gospel story? And that's when I started seeing, if these stories are wrong, these core ideas that we have in our head, we pick them up from when we're kids, our parents, religious leaders, whatever. If they're wrong, they will, as Dallas would say, they'll run and ruin our lives. So that's because The Good and Beautiful God, which is the first in the series, was the last I started working on, because I didn't know how wrong people had their views of God were just so far off from that of Jesus. And so, and I often say to people that there's only one answer to the question, what is God like? And the answer is Jesus. That's it. John 14:9. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So that Jesus is the corrective of all of our wrong narratives about God. So God narratives, self narratives that are just toxic, we pick them up early. They cripple us. And then gospel stories. And, you and I both learned that from Dallas, where I grew up with a gospel that said, have the right understanding of the atonement and you get to go to heaven when you die. Or I like, John, you talk about the pleasure factory. I've been using one of your phrases. But that was all I understood Christianity to be. So when Dallas is saying the gospel is that the kingdom is here now, it's unshakable, and you can step into that life, it was like, that's a different story. So, and when I think about myself, I say, this is my mantra to myself. I say this almost every day, John. I just say, I am divinely designed, deeply desired, lavishly loved, fully forgiven, a sacred story of grace. That's
wow.
Literally.
Wow. Can you say that one more time, but just a phrase at a time so we can absorb it?
Yeah. Divinely designed. So I'm no accident. God chose me to come into existence before the foundation of the world.
Yeah.
So I'm no junk. I was divinely designed. I am deeply desired. God doesn't just, love me because he has to, but God actually is fond of me, loves me, desires me.
A lot of people, where they really wrestle with believing that, comes out of the pain and the brokenness of our stories and the loss and the grief, and none of us gets the story that we want. And I know that's been a big part of the journey also for you, and you've written about how you and your wife Megan had to go through that. Can you tell folks a bit about what that journey involved, and how did you find or cling to or come back to or not gone through that?
Yeah, well, so my wife Megan and I had our first child, Jacob. I think he was 4 years old. We were pregnant with the second child, and we knew the gender. We were very excited, but very toward the end of the pregnancy, the doctors were concerned. They did a bunch of sonograms, and they essentially said, we think that this child has some sort of a chromosomal problem. Could be trisomy 13 or 18, which is fatal right away. But they were very dark with their prognosis, and so we went from painting a nursery to planning a funeral in a matter of 24 hours, and so that was just shocking. I think my narrative was, I'm God's guy. I write books about God. I talk about God's love. This doesn't happen to me. So that was a huge shock to us. Madeline was born. She had a chromosomal translocation, which wasn't immediately fatal, but we lived pretty much in hospitals for 2 years, and at the mercy of nurses and doctors trying to help us. And it was a short life, but she taught me more than anyone about God, about faith, about what life is all about. I had a very meaningful conversation with Dallas and Jane. I did not know that they had lost twins, and so they were able to speak into my situation in a way that probably no one else who's experienced that could. So I was living off their faith in many ways, that God is good. This is not the end. And so I learned a lot. 6 months after Madeline was born, I had lunch with this pastor. I didn't know him well, but he literally said to me during lunch, so Jim, who sinned, you or your wife, that caused this to happen? And I was,
no,
what? And that made me really realize, that narrative out there. Obviously, Jesus faced it, Job faced it, and
wow.
Jesus' disciples said, so Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, or the man born blind? So it's been around forever. It's still alive and well in our churches. And so it made me confront, is that the story I believe? And I rejected it and said, that is not what I see in Jesus. Jesus denied that story consistently. People were killed by a tower that fell on him. His disciples, what did they do to cause that? There was a massacre. What did they do to cause? 3 times Jesus faces that narrative and says, this is not the narrative. This is not the thing. And so I had to learn how to live into that. And then eventually the most healing thing for me was I started writing in my journal about it, and ended up accidentally writing a book called Room of Marbles, which is a story about heaven. And so I got kind of a vision, a Dante-esque sort of thing, what is happening to the people that we've lost? And so it's this sort of story about heaven that healed me anyway, and I was changed by that. But that has been the deepest thing that we've had to face, and boy, life deals those hard things a lot.
I was reading, and I can't remember if it was in a book or an interview with you. You talked about, and I had forgotten, there's kind of an extended quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer that was on, I think, the Bulletin.
We sat together at Dallas's actual funeral.
Yep.
That Bonhoeffer quote, I got it right in front of me if you don't have it, because I literally have it on my wall.
Oh, that's amazing. I've got it here, but please go ahead, because I thought just the first couple of sentences. There is nothing that can replace the absence of someone dear to us. That was just helpful. I mean, today I was just reading through this and thinking about my own life, and these words were so helpful. There is nothing that can replace the absence of someone dear to us, and one should not even attempt to do so. One must simply hold out and endure it. At first, that sounds very hard, but at the same time, it is also a great comfort.
Yeah. Boy, that has stayed with me, that Bonhoeffer quote. We pray, God, fill that gap, and Bonhoeffer saying he's not going to fill the gap. The gap's how I stay connected to the people that I love. It's my connection. So when I still have a little sting of the pain of Dallas's loss, even though it's been over a decade, I'll sometimes just say, that little sting, that pain, that gap is the way I stay connected to him and keep that alive. And so I think that's so profound.
You actually give a wonderful little framework for how do you pursue getting your story healed. We can't heal our own stories, but there are things that we can do following the principle of indirection. And I wrote them down. I don't know how this is for you as somebody who writes. I know sometimes I will have written a book and then somebody may ask me quite a while later, because even by the time it gets published, it was back in the rearview mirror for me. You talk about 7 fundamental qualities of love in chapter 6 of this book. What are they? It's like, I can't remember anymore. So you probably never experienced that. But you give an exercise or a framework, and I have written down the elements of it. So I will not put you on the spot by asking you to recall them. I'll just name them and then ask you to comment on them a bit.
Thank you. I thought
it was a wonderful framework or guidance, and I think we might even be able to put something in writing if you're watching this, so that you can use it if you would like to in your life. But like, how do I bring my story to God for it to be healed? And you talk first about having a time of divine connection, or remembering that so that you can experience it. And then remembering, asking Jesus how I was shaped by others. Where was I treasured or assaulted or so? And then asking, are there any false narratives in my life? And that was particularly around, Dallas would talk about the 2 primary forms that sin against people takes. We assault them or we withdraw from them. And then allow Jesus to retell your story. That was very interesting. You point out how similar the word restore is to restory. And then finally, try to retell your story. So whatever color commentary you want to give to folks who might want to spend a little time around their story with this exercise.
Well, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That was, again, a part of that chapter that was so hard to write, but I think it's the chapter I'm most proud of in the book, because I think there's just a lot of deep things, and most of that came from the suffering that I endured. You may also recall, John, that I tell my daughter's story of her own assault, and at her permission and request, and she had a very profound experience for her in therapy, but that kind of tells that, because she buried what happened to her when she was 13 by an older boy in her school, and it was traumatic, and it came out later with anxiety and all kinds of other presenting things. And in the process of her therapy, some of those things that you just described about how to remember in a redemptive way, how to let Jesus tell that story in a new way. And
No, and part
she
of
had a
what
very
was so
profound.
part of what was so striking about that story is, if I remember rightly, she was kind of reluctant to let you and Megan know about the pain that she had experienced, because after you lost a daughter and then she came, her name was Hope.
Right.
And so that was such a beautiful thing, such a beautiful expression, but stories get so complicated. And so just think that name, which was such a great gift and such a great milestone of God's goodness, could also become something where I could say, oh, then I can't be deeply truthful about what my experience has been because I might not live up to my name.
Yeah, exactly. Her name became a burden because she had gone through this experience, and her counselor told us that privately. We met first with her counselor. She said, Hope wants me to meet with you first. And then that's when she shared that story, that because of what happened to her and because her name is Hope, she felt like in this broken family, I have to be positive. I have to be the good. I have to always be that for this family that heals them because I'm the joy. I bring all the good. Here's this terrible thing that happened to me. Now my name's a burden, which crushed Megan and I.
Of course.
That name, every time we say her name, that reminds us, yes, we had this experience with our daughter Madeline, but there is hope. And so it was quite profound. But in her therapy session, the key moment was because our therapist asked her, where was Jesus in your assault? And she was like, I didn't want him there. Like I didn't. And she was able in prayer and in meditation to be able to say to Jesus, I'm sorry, I didn't let you in to this story. And then Jesus was able to come back in and say, I had you, like, it's okay. I'm with you. And that was a big part of her healing during that week of therapy.
Wow. So any other thoughts, Jim, from this exercise as people go through it? A time of divine connection, recognizing false narrative.
I do love that the retelling your story, and that you mentioned Rich Mullins. He was a singer-songwriter, a good friend of mine, lived with us, dear friend. And when he was working on the reservation in New Mexico, that's the last 2 years of his life. He did that. He wanted to teach music to Native American kids, and he went to this. I think he was like a first or second grade teacher. He went to this classroom, and it was in English. That was the subject of the day. And this thing that this teacher, elementary school teacher, did every week was they got to write a story together, and one of the kids was chosen to be the protagonist in the story. Like they got to be the main character. And so she would say, okay, we're going to write our story today. And Rich is sitting there, right? He's sitting there watching these Native kids. And there was this little boy who wanted to be the protagonist. He wanted to be. And so he leaned forward and he said, teacher, write me into your story.
Oh.
And Rich had this epiphany. And his last album that he would write before the car crash, it's called the Jesus album. There's the central song of the album is called Jesus. And that line is in the song where he cries out, Jesus, write me into your story. Wow. And that's, when I think of that longing, that Jesus, write me into your
No, gosh,
story.
What a great prayer. Like, just what a great way to start the day. Hey, Jesus, today, write me into your story.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So while we're going through this series, a primary resource for it has been Devotional Classics.
Oh, yeah.
And it's consists of readings from the great voices, minds, pilgrims, strugglers, pioneers of the spiritual life in the Christian world over the last couple of thousand years. And you and Richard Foster edited it. It is the best devotional resource, for lack of a better word, that I know. It's like cherry picking the best passages from the best thinkers and writers across the ages and making them very accessible. and then giving kind of a framework, scripture, questions to reflect on. I remember when it first came out, just thinking, this is so helpful. And for a lot of us, it can be pretty intimidating to think I'm going to try to dive real deeply into Augustine or Bernard of Clairvaux, but this is like a sampler, and it's so good. What was it like putting that together? And here's what I was thinking. Was there anybody in there that you particularly resonate with? Like as you were reading through that person, you think, man, I like that person. And was there anybody where you felt like, man, I don't get that voice at all? It's just like, don't think so. No thanks.
That's a cool question. Yeah. Well, so when I was studying with Richard as an undergraduate, I had a course with him where he started me reading these people, the actual original sources. I'm reading Interior Castle, Teresa of Avila. I'm reading original Wesley stuff. I'm reading St. Augustine. I read Confessions. And so I'm reading all these. And once I got started, I got hooked. I'm going to and those are hard to find books. They're not in your classic regular evangelical kind of Christian bookstores. You're hard pressed. But I was finding them, and I would read them, and I would study them. And I was talking to a group of church people, just lay people, and it was in this audience. And I said, well, someone said, what's the biggest influence in your life, in your formation?
Yeah.
I said, okay, obviously the Bible. I have to say the Bible, and I have to say prayer. But I said, but after that, it's the devotional classics. And they looked at me like I had just spoken Chinese. They said, what are you talking about? And I said, Bernard of Clairvaux and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, C.S. Lewis, even at that point. And I started naming people, and they looked at me like, I said, you don't know any of these people. So I went to Richard and said, I don't think the average layperson knows who these people are. And again, I because my Christianity was under him, I just thought everybody read St. Augustine. Doesn't everybody read that stuff? And so I said, Richard, we have to do something to get this in the hands of the people. And so he said, let's think about that. And I said, how about if we just do excerpts from the greatest hits of the saints? We just take the best ones and the best ones. And I remember Richard, he walked around. We were up in my living room in my house, in my apartment, and I remember he walked around like 3 times in a circle, like rubbing his beard, and finally he just went, "Let's do it." Okay, let's do it. And little did I know that meant the lion's share of the work was on me.
That meant because you do it.
Yeah. I'll be a general editor, but you do that work, because this was this is when I was typing. Like I didn't have. This was not online in those days. I literally typed in every single one. Wow. And so my method was I'd just go, okay, we're going to read from this book, and I'd pull it off the shelf, and then I just went thumb like this, and wherever there's a ton of yellow or massive highlights, that became the selection. I thought,
no kidding. Wow.
I highlighted the heck out of that part of Confessions by Augustine, so must be good. It was to me, and that became the way. And so I typed them all in, and then we wrote the bio and the intro and the questions. And so, but I'm thankful for you for saying that, because that was a labor of love, a hard book personally. But yeah, I'm so glad that it's been out in the world helping people just discover these incredible treasures.
Yeah, well, you have the spiritual gift of highlighting. Who knew?
I'm a great highlighter.
Yeah.
I am excellent at
Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking about, I think it was as you were talking about Dallas and how if people have the wrong narrative, they'll end up worse rather than better if they pursue spiritual practices like fasting to appease an angry God. Lauren Winner wrote a book, I think it's called The Danger of Spiritual Practices, in the last couple of years. And she has 1/3 of it is about prayer. She goes through prayer diaries of women in the slaveholding South in the early 1800s, and how they write out prayers in their journal to God, which are complaining, lamenting about the lack of servility and hyper-obedience on the part of their African-American slaves. And part of what Lord is pointing out is, and of course Jesus did the same thing, story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. We can sometimes think, well, as long as I'm praying, I'm getting better. As long as I'm engaging in these practices, I'm getting better. No. It's altogether possible to engage in that practice and get worse, and not to understand what's the larger story that's embedded in. And I remember you talking one time about, as you were thinking about trying to help people with spiritual practices, Dallas Willard naming, well, here's the one people are going to do worst at. They're not going to like it, and it will be the biggest problem for them. And you said, no, Dallas, you're wrong. But it ended up he wasn't wrong. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, Holy Leisure.
Yeah.
When I wrote the Spiritual Formation Workbook, our first of our resource, I had a list of practices that I was going to try with a group. I think there were 8 or something, and it was the usual suspects. It was scripture reading, and it was a service act, and it was prayer and various things. But one of them was Holy Leisure, which I learned from him and Dallas. And Dallas looked at the list and said, "Oh, your people will fail at that one." I said, "We're not going to fail at that. It's just doing nothing for 15 minutes. I mean, how are we going to fail like it?" And it's like read a chapter of the Bible a week and go to the soup kitchen and 15 minutes of prayer. I mean, I thought those are hard. And he said,
"No, but doing nothing. How can you fail at doing nothing? All you have to do is nothing."
Yeah. And of course, we got back week after week. How did you do with these practices? We get to Holy Leisure and people would just look down. Okay. Whenever, you know that as a professor, I know when you look down, I mean, please don't call because they had failed. And I had to call Dallas and say, "Yeah, you were right again." It's because
that's a phrase the man had never heard before.
Yeah, right.
So
how do you maintain humility?
For people who are scratching their heads right now, why in the world would doing nothing be useful, beneficial, a spiritual practice? Why should somebody even consider the possibility of intentionally doing nothing?
To deepen the narrative that I'm not in control and that the world is fine without me running it. And that's why it's so hard. Holy Leisure is so hard for us because we let go of that need to control. And it allows us, if we can get there, to simply be, to just, I'm not doing, I'm just being. I led a retreat with a Christian high school, and the very first day, very first practice, I said, "Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have 15 minutes of Holy Leisure." And they looked at me like, "What is it?" I explained what it was. And I said, "You're going to go off into this retreat center, find a quiet place by yourself for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back." I wanted their souls to catch up to their bodies. And so I walked it through, and when I was about to send them out, the headmaster of the school, very type A guy, he waits for everybody to leave. He comes in, he says, "I can't do this." I said, "You can't do it?" He said, I cannot do this." And I thought, okay, how do I help this cat figure it out? And I went, do it for this. It's an assignment. And he went, "I got it." So they all went off. They came back 15 minutes later, and people were sharing stories of, "This was really helpful. I'm more at peace. I mean, I'm more present. I'm more here now." That was great. But then this headmaster, he raised his hand, said yes, and he stands up, turns and looks at his entire, like this is his faculty, his staff, everybody. He's the head guy. Mm-hmm. He turns and looks at him and says, "This was the most powerful experience I've ever had. And I want you to commit to hold me accountable, to tell me I have to do this every day. I need 15 minutes of doing this every day." And I was shocked by it. But I thought, he lived with a narrative that everything was on his shoulders. And I think Holy Leisure just breaks that and helps us go, okay, no, it's not on me. As another Dallas phrase, you don't have to make it happen. He needed to learn, but he doesn't need to make this happen. He didn't need to run that school. There's something else at work. So
that idea
powerful
of
discipline.
Deepening the narrative that I'm not in control means not just that I think about it more, but it actually then gets into my body. It gets into my reflexes and my perceptions and my heart rate. So coming back to why is it that Dallas was able to be in an airport and have delays and be so untroubled by it? And part of that was through things like Holy Leisure. A different story had just become apparently true to him.
Yeah, he kept his mind, as it says in Colossians, on things above. I mean, I can remember so many times in the morning, his room was adjoining mine at this retreat center, and I'm just hearing him singing hymns. And I just thought, this guy wakes up singing hymns. And, that's, and then the other thing that was stunning to me was, here we teach all day, we'd get home at night. I was tired, he was tired, but after dinner and so forth, he would spend at least an hour or more in the scriptures memorizing.
Yeah.
Like, he had his Bible open and he had a little notepad, and I was like, are you studying the Bible right now? He's like, no, I'm memorizing. And I just thought, yeah, that you do these practices over time with the right spirit, like not to get God, with the right narratives, these disciplines will open up the aperture of grace. I like to say, like, grace is going to.
Oh, that's so good.
It sure did on you.
That's so good. Yeah, and there really was a sense that it was recreational for him, and the way that for lots of us, we would surf the web or look up whatever or post wherever.
Right.
These things, there was nothing particularly spiritual about it. It was just kind of recreational. It was like it ushered him into a way of life and a way of being and a quality of mind that he liked better than any alternative.
Well said. Yeah. I don't think, he would have been bored. I mean, like I said, we watched like 15 minutes of television, and I asked him, so you do this? He goes, sometimes for my brain to slow down. That's it. And then he would turn it off. Like he'd only did it to actually just keep him from, because he thinks so, his brain was on such high energy.
Kill off a few excess brain cells.
Yeah. Right.
Well,
he had plenty.
This has been a wonderful conversation, James Smith. Oh, and I should mention also, I believe you are the host of Speaking About Things Above podcast.
Yeah, that's been fun. I've had you on the podcast, I think, twice. So yeah, I love podcasting. It's been a fun medium just to, reach people when, as Dallas said, when you're sleeping, they might be listening. So I love it.
Thank you for coming on to this one. I'm never quite sure what to call it. It's kind of a daily teaching, help people to connect with God. Devotional sounds a little formal and spiritual. Sometimes people just say the show. Have you been on the show? So thank you for coming on the show.
Well, I'll tell you what, John, I've literally in the last 6 months talked to 2 pastors who didn't understand formation, and now they do, and they're trying to make it a part of their church solely because of this show. Well, and I kid you not, they've started listening, and you have such an incredible way of sharing it in a non-threatening, scary way. And these guys are, they weren't shy in just saying, no, I started listening to John's show, and I can't get enough of this stuff. And so,
wow,
good work.
That's very encouraging. On with the show. Thank you, Jim Smith.
Thank you, John.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any future teachings from John Ortberg here at Become New. My name's Tim, and I'm a part of the team here. This series is all about stories. Everybody has a story, and everybody's story matters. And we want to know about your story, whether it's a story of coming to faith or a story of spiritual growth. Whatever it is, we're here for you. You can email that to us at connect@becomenew.com, or you can text it to us. You can also sign up for daily reminders whenever we drop a new video via text by texting the word BECOME to the number 855-888-0444. You can also send us prayer requests there. There's a team of us that meet to pray each weekday for viewers just like yourself. If you'd like to receive the emails that go along with each video, be sure to check that out at becomenew.com/subscribe. More than a video to watch, this is really a community to belong to, and we're so glad that you're a part of it. We'll catch you next time.